And so finally now, I'll just queue up Emma's slides. So today we are joined for our final session, our final mini masterclass for the time being, by Dr. Emma Hock, who is going to be talking about exploring the impact of housing insecurity on the health and well-being of children and young people. So I'll just put your slides up now and I will hand over to Emma.
Great, thank you very much, Angie. So my name's Emma Hock. I'm a senior lecturer and systematic reviewer within the Sheffield Centre for Health and Related Research and also the School for Medicine and Population Health at the University of Sheffield. And I'm going to be presenting a systematic review that myself and colleagues undertook, which was for the NIHR Public Health Reviews team. So I should acknowledge funding from the NIHR, which related to the impact of housing insecurity on the health and well-being of children and young people. So before we go any further, I'll define what housing insecurity is. So housing insecurity, we use the Children's Society definition throughout this work, which means that this would be people who are experiencing or being at risk of multiple moves, which are not through choice and are related to poverty. So I'll just talk a bit about the extent of the problem. It's recently become a much bigger problem among children and families because of the higher cost and lower availability of housing. And more low-income families are now living in the private rental sector, which can be quite precarious. And this has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and also the cost of living crisis, which has meant that more sort of families and children and young people are experiencing housing insecurity. So it's quite a large public health problem. The health impact of housing insecurity has been documented in relation to children. There are a whole load of studies which have looked at the associations between housing insecurity and various different outcomes. However, this data was largely quantitative, and the reviews of the data have been sort of in terms of quantifying the relationship and assessing the strength of the relationship. Whereas we recognise that actually there might be a lot of confounders in that, and it's very difficult to know obviously what exactly is sort of causing some of the outcomes and which aspects of housing insecurity are impacting on which aspects of children and young people's lives in order to have these health outcomes. So the pathways overall aren't well understood, and we wanted to address that gap in the evidence by conducting this review. So the aim was to conduct a systematic review to identify, appraise and synthesise research evidence that explores the relationship between housing insecurity and the health and well-being of children and young people. So what we wanted to do there was to highlight all the relevant factors and causal mechanisms so that we could make evidence-based recommendations for policy, practice and future research priorities. So to do this, we had a team of local researchers, but also a very large team of stakeholders as well, who were people working within various different bodies relating to housing and health, including people in academic departments, people in local authorities, people who work with families and children, people in charities. And with these stakeholders, we developed a conceptual framework of the pathway from housing insecurity to health and well-being, which I'll show you in the next slide. And that was sort of to focus the review a bit and help us to sort of map out the pathways. But these stakeholders were very useful because they also informed us of some potential sources that we could search for what we call grey literature, which is literature that might be relevant or important but isn't published in academic publications. So they provided us with websites where we might find reports of research that's being conducted but hasn't been published academically. In addition to looking at all of that grey literature, we searched some academic databases as well to get academic literature. And we also followed up on relevant looking articles that were in the reference lists of studies that we included in our review. And the focus of this review in particular was children who were aged 0 to 16, who were experiencing or were at risk of housing insecurity and were living in a family unit. So not children on their own, but children who were living within a family. And we kept the focus of this review on the UK. So once we'd done the searches, we went through the usual processes of conducting a systematic review. We screened titles, abstracts and full texts. A proportion of these were checked. And then we extracted key details from the papers and assessed the quality of each study. And then once we'd done all of that, we spent quite a long time bringing the findings together, synthesizing the findings. We did this in two particular ways. We looked at themes within the data, and we also related the themes to the framework that we'd earlier identified with stakeholders, so that we could look at some of the pathways. So this is a very simplified version of the framework. It has three main components. So we wanted to look at exposures, impacts and outcomes. And exposures were defined as sort of people's experiences of housing insecurity, and also the things that might lead to housing insecurity, the precursors, which seemed to us to be part of that experience. Then the impacts were things that impacted on the day-to-day life of the children and young people. So the ways in which housing insecurity affected their day-to-day lives. And then we classified outcomes as being any impact on the health and well-being of children and young people. So essentially, I suppose, longer term, more distal health impacts. And we used this as a starting point. We did sort of refine it and progress it throughout the process of conducting the review. So we did look at an awful lot of literature, and it took a very long time because some of the literature, particularly grey literature, were very long reports that we had to look through to find accounts of children and young people. I should say we were looking for qualitative evidence where people actually described their experiences and the impact that their housing situation had on their lives. And we were looking for not just accounts from children and young people, but accounts from people close to them. So parents, teachers, doctors, paediatricians. So we had to look through an awful lot of evidence and very long reports, which took quite a long time. In the end, we came up with a set of 59 studies that examined this issue, and probably about half of them were grey literature reports. So this is obviously a huge amount of evidence, particularly considering it was qualitative evidence, so quite detailed. So we wanted to sort of manage it in the best way possible, and we saw that we could quite easily divide the evidence up into four populations. So first there was a general population, which was sort of the largest population, and this was sort of people experiencing housing insecurity in general without any specific defining characteristics. The second one was that we saw children and families who were very clearly experiencing housing insecurity as a result of experiencing domestic violence. So they seem to fit into their own population. The third one is migrants, refugees and asylum seekers, who we do acknowledge are not a homogenous group. They're very different from each other, and even within the groups there are considerable differences. However, they seem to be facing a lot of similar challenges, so for pragmatic purposes we grouped those groups of people together. And the last population was people who were forced to relocate from their current housing, which was a block of flats, because it was about to be demolished. So we'll go through each of the categories and the pathway sort of separately, and explore some of the ways in which housing insecurity manifested and impacted on the children and young people. So in terms of their exposures, first of all, their experiences of housing insecurity, there were quite a large variety of these. So, for example, the family might have had trouble paying the rent and were facing eviction. And that could be something that had actually happened, or it could be something that they were going through at the time, and they were worried about being evicted. It wasn't uncommon for families to be moving multiple times, constantly having to pack up and move for one reason or another. Part of the reason would have been due to the above, problems paying rent, and also because of other factors, such as perhaps they were in temporary accommodation, perhaps they had a short-term tenancy. Homelessness wasn't uncommon either. There weren't really any accounts of street homelessness, although I think the closest we came to this was in the migrant, refugee and asylum seeker population, which I'll talk about a bit later on. But there were accounts of people sleeping on sofas of family and friends. Temporary accommodation was something that a lot of people in the studies that we included experienced. So these were a whole variety of settings. Many of them didn't seem very suitable for families. So bed and breakfast accommodation, a room in a hostel, which they might be sharing with single adults, perhaps who had histories of violence and drug use. It could be converted shipping containers, converted warehouses, and that sort of thing. So accommodation that was designed to be temporary, as a sort of a temporary emergency solution for the family, but sometimes they ended up staying a lot longer than they wanted to. It might be that people had trouble finding new housing. So, for example, some places didn't take people who were on benefits, and the family were on benefits, so that presented a barrier. Quite often people ended up living somewhere they didn't want to live, which meant that they would then need to move for their life to, I suppose, to work. It could be undesired because of the nature of the area. Perhaps there was a lot of trouble, they didn't feel safe, or it could have been because they weren't close to anything that they needed to be close to, so school, the parents' work, friends, activities. So that was quite a common thing. And generally, the feeling of being insecure and the loss of stability was a particular part of children's experiences, because sometimes they wouldn't necessarily have knowledge of all the other things, but they just felt like they were going to have to move, and they couldn't really settle. Overcrowding was also a big problem. So this would be people obviously being in too small a space for the amount of people, not having the room that they need. And this was a very common feature of temporary accommodation, but also in accommodation that they were sort of meant to be renting as a slightly more permanent solution. And that would drive housing insecurity, because obviously it wasn't viable to be living in overcrowded situations, so people would then be looking to move. And there were also instances where the properties weren't in good condition, which would prompt sort of a drive to move one way or another, either because they were worried about reporting things to the landlord because they were worried about the cost of rent or being evicted, or because they couldn't repair them themselves. So these were kinds of the experiences that the children and young people had. And so here's an example from the literature. No, it's a box, because with it being so small, we've had to buy daughter 1 a camp bed, like just a small 3-foot one. And daughter 2 is in daughter 1's old cot bed, and it's literally right next to the radiator under the window. So that's somebody describing their overcrowded situation. So what impact did this have on the children and young people? We found a huge variety of impacts on their day-to-day lives, and we specifically focused on things that we thought might affect their children, affect their health and well-being. So impacts on friendships was a really big one. So quite often the children and young people would end up either moving far away from friends or moving multiple times. And this would affect their contact with existing friends. And also sometimes they feel like they had to constantly make new friends. So they constantly be the new person in the neighbourhood, and constantly have to get in with the other kids. And there were, I suppose, more subtle impacts as well. So children would feel like they couldn't go on sleepovers to friends' houses if their own accommodation was not very good, because they wouldn't be able to invite them back in return. So there were quite a few impacts on friendships. And it's worth bearing in mind that these are children and young people who are living in poverty, so they wouldn't necessarily have the means to maintain long distance contact. For example, they might not have a mobile phone, or the mobile phone they have might not have the right phone numbers in it. So this was a particular challenge and something that could really affect the health and well-being of children and young people. And related to that, another big factor was school. So generally families were faced with two options. They could keep the child at the same school, or the child could move school. And sometimes this felt like an impossible choice because they didn't necessarily know where they were going to be moved next. So quite often families would choose to keep children at the same school, but quite often this would involve considerable difficulty. For example, extremely long journeys to school involving multiple forms of transport, buses, trains, having to set off at ridiculously early times. I think 5 a.m. was mentioned in one study, and not returning until late at night. So this could obviously really impact children's health and well-being. They would feel tired. Again, that impacted on friendships because they couldn't hang out with friends after school, or go to after-school clubs. And it also impacts on their education because it limited the amount of time they had to do homework. But by the same token, moving schools wasn't always the best option. So if children stayed in the same school, at least they would have school as a source of stability in their lives. Having to move school removed that, and it meant that children weren't familiar with teachers, other children. It would be more difficult, having to constantly make friends and be the new child. So this was an impossible decision, really, for families to make, because whatever you did, there'd be a detrimental impact. Family relationships were also impacted on, not just, I think, because of the stress of the situation, but also because of practical things, like sometimes children would stay over with other people on school nights, which meant they might be more close to those people, other family members, friends, but less close to their immediate family. And also there were impacts from certain features of the accommodation that they might be in. So diet, hygiene and noise were factors that we identified in particular. So diet, because there wasn't always facilities to cook food, and if there was, it wasn't always very good or very safe. So families would end up having to eat things, I suppose, that were convenient and that they didn't necessarily want to eat. And this could affect children's health and well-being. It was difficult to maintain hygiene, particularly in temporary accommodation places like hostels with shared washing facilities, and also shared facilities for washing clothes. So that then had an impact on children, I guess, feeling like they might fit in somewhere like school if they weren't washed and their clothes weren't washed and they looked a bit unkempt. It would then be more difficult to make friends, and they would feel a bit different to everyone else. And then the noise as well was a big impact. So some of the places that children and families ended up living were quite noisy places. They would be noise, for example, from inside the property. If it was a hostel or a bed and breakfast, there might be people shouting, arguing. Quite often it would be quite chaotic. But also noise from out on the street. I guess unfamiliar noises, which would keep children awake at night, disrupt their ability to do things like homework, and also just be a general stressor. Psychological impacts, I've mentioned some of these, so feeling different, not feeling safe, not feeling like you really fit in. These were sort of things that could lead to mental health problems further down the line. And just that feeling of not having a home, not having a sort of a secure space, and not being grounded in that aspect led to a sort of feeling of not having stability. Quite often the housing insecurity affected the well-being of parents, which would then impact on the well-being of the children and young people, because they would see their parents stressed, struggling, and they would feel, I guess, stressed and anxious themselves because they knew that there was something wrong. And in fact, quite often children, reported not telling their parents about things they were worried about because they didn't want to worry their parents further, which obviously then had implications for the children's mental health. And overcrowding I've mentioned in terms of experiences and exposures, but that also was an impact because if people were in an insecure housing situation, they could then be moved to somewhere which was too small and didn't really have a choice. It was a case of if you don't accept this, you don't have anywhere. So people often end up in overcrowded situations, and likewise with poor and unsuitable property, people would end up in properties with mould, with infestations, fixtures and fittings that were broken and damaged, perhaps lots of stairs if they have very small children to carry, or push chairs and so on. So these things were quite an impact on the families. And the financial impact shouldn't be understated because as well as I suppose that these are people who are already living in poverty, and the cost of having to move and the cost of having to move multiple times at very short notice could make quite a considerable dent in the finances of the families. For example, having to just leave furniture, carpets and so on, and just buy new carpets, curtains, furniture every time they move to a new place. And that financial outlay has the potential to impact on the children's health. And also access to services. So if children were receiving medical care, for example, at a particular institution, and then they ended up moving a long way away, for instance, if they were seeing a doctor in London and then moved to Birmingham, then that would impact on their ability to receive that care and impact on their health. In some cases, there was a positive impact in that families did move to somewhere that was better, so perhaps more safe, a bit bigger, in better condition. But this was vastly outweighed by all the negative impacts, and quite often, even if it was a better location, it might still be somewhere that was insecure. But overlaying all of this was the whole idea of choice and control being taken away from the families, and in particular the children who felt like they had even less choice and control. So, for instance, here are some quotations from the evidence. So, my 12-year-old daughter has gone to 8 different schools and has really struggled with constantly making friends and losing friends because of all of our moves. All the upheaval makes her so unhappy. And then little girl aged 11 said, when we sleep, water drips on us, which we don't like. This kind of highlights the severity of the situation. So what effect did this have on children's outcomes? As you can probably imagine, this would affect children's mental health. I mean, health impacts weren't talked about as much as day-to-day life impacts in literature, but quite often we found that mental health problems manifested themselves in children as behavioural issues, perhaps being aggressive, being withdrawn, and things like wetting the bed, because they weren't always able to obviously express how they were feeling. But also, poor physical health was an issue. So conditions such as asthma from poor conditioned housing was something that happened to children and young people. Tiredness was a huge issue for all the reasons that I've spoken about, because just getting enough rest was difficult to impossible in a lot of these situations. And we also found instances where child development was stunted. So, for example, one study reported a house that was infested with vermin, and the family didn't feel that they were able to put their baby on the floor to crawl, so they weren't crawling and walking because of the state of the housing. And also speech delay was reported in several children, which might have been as a consequence of the stress. And weight loss was also reported relating to the worry of the situation. So things like, my 6-year-old has been going to the doctors because he's developed a nervous tic since we've been in that room. He was constantly nervous all the time. He's so unsettled, and he knows that we're still not settled. He's really anxious. He's become violent. And I just can't sleep. I just keep thinking about things. So one thing we did find, which wasn't in our initial conceptual framework, was that we did find some protective factors, some things that might help to sort of ease the negative impact of the situation. So friendship, having and maintaining friendships was something that helped children to maintain well-being even in the face of all of this adversity. And very similarly, staying in the same school could be something that facilitated those friendships and also kept children with a sense of stability. Some children adopted a mindset of sort of, this is a normal situation, to kind of help them to cope with it. And some families reported doing things like homemaking to try and sort of make the place feel a bit more like home, even if it was temporary. And quite a few studies reported parents doing things to protect their children from knowing about the situation or knowing the worst of the situation. So they might, for example, pretend it was a big adventure, or they would take the children out to the park lots, and so on and so forth, to try and sort of make it seem a bit less difficult for the children, and obviously hiding important details about the housing situation and not letting on was something that parents did, as you would, but as I think we've seen, children get a sense that there's something wrong anyway. And we found a couple of studies that reported intervention programs, although the interventions didn't actually address the housing situation. They just addressed the behaviour of the children and worked with families to reduce the likelihood of being evicted through things that were down to them. So I suppose the family's conduct. But really it was, I suppose, like sticking a plaster on a broken leg. And we didn't find any evidence to suggest that these removed the negative impacts. These were sort of very much sticking plasters. So, well, in a way, I found it quite annoying because we've never been secure and had loads of friends in the one place. But in a way, I found it quite reassuring that I've found out about all these places and I know about them a little bit. So that's an example of the sort of shift in mindset. So I wanted to demonstrate some of the pathways. I'm not going to talk about this and I'm not expecting you to see it, but I just wanted to illustrate the complexity of all these many complex factors and how they relate to one another. So this is, I think, just for the general population as well. We came up with a diagram like this for all the populations. So as you can see, it's really not straightforward. There are lots of, I suppose, complex impacts which have various effects on health and well-being. I want to talk a little bit now about some of the specific populations. So because there were things about these populations that were particular issues. So for families who were trying to escape from domestic violence, they essentially had a choice of either leaving the property and leaving the perpetrator, or staying in the property and making the perpetrator leave. And neither of these things are perfect. As you can imagine, it's a difficult choice. But we did find an intervention called the sanctuary scheme, which helped families to remain in their home and keep the perpetrator out by providing additional security that would help families feel safe. But the majority of the time, people would leave the home and end up in insecure accommodation, quite often a series of temporary accommodation options. And I suppose underlying all of this was the additional worry that the perpetrator might find them. So this made friendships a lot more challenging because children couldn't really open up about themselves. They couldn't say, for example, where they lived or many details about themselves because they had to keep that information safe so the perpetrator wouldn't find them. Which, as we've seen, since friendship was a protective factor, made life additionally difficult for children escaping domestic violence. And remaining in the home was also risky in terms of if the perpetrator was meant to be paying the rent or the mortgage, then they could withhold that as a form of violence against the family, and this could cause worry. This is what happened in this first account. So I've lost 2 stone. My son has lost £10. He's only 15. He's having counselling at school. It's just been a nightmare. He, as in the perpetrator, hasn't paid the mortgage for a year because he wants to get me out so he can have the money. And then an account from someone else. And then she had to miss out on school. And then when we were moving to where we are now, it was a different school again. So it's not just women it affects, it's the children as well. So I want to talk a bit about migrants, refugees and asylum seekers. So this population was, well, as I've said, it's several different populations, but one thing they had in common was that financially they were often in dire straits. People had very little notice before they had to leave a property, sometimes as little as 48 hours, which would obviously be extremely stressful for the whole family. Some families actually ended up sleeping in really, really unsuitable places. So one family reported sleeping on the night bus. They'd board the bus and just ride around it all night to try and get some sleep. Or the waiting room of A&E. And this obviously caused huge problems for children because they weren't able to sleep properly. Such as tiredness, trouble concentrating, having aches and pains from not sleeping in a proper bed. And families reported that not having recourse to public funds in the case of particularly asylum seekers would make the situation worse because they would just have no money whatsoever from anywhere. Which is why people ended up resorting to such desperate measures. So some examples. So this is from a paper. So Anton, age 7, Via, age 5, Jade and age 1 and their mum Naomi started sleeping on the night bus after they were evicted from their flat due to rent arrears. Sometimes they were so tired they couldn't make it to school. And any time I said, "Mum, can we go home?" I forgot that we didn't have a home, so I couldn't. My mum said, "Which home?" And I said, "Oh yeah, we don't have a home." And then I didn't want to talk anymore. I was feeling very sad. So the last specific population that we considered was people who had to move because the block of flats they were living in was scheduled to be demolished because the area was being gentrified. So everybody in that block was essentially placed into housing insecurity and were having to find somewhere else to live. And one thing they had in common was they had to move by a certain date. Some families did plan to move anyway because they weren't satisfied with the condition of the housing. It was small, overcrowded, and not particularly nice, in quite a poor state of repair. So this provided them with the catalyst of being able to get out of there when perhaps they felt like they couldn't. But then the options for places to move into were quite limited. People ended up sometimes moving to areas that were not where they wanted to live, having to leave behind important social networks. And also some families had trouble finding a home that was the right size for them. So this example illustrates that. So my children was with me, they're happy, they want to see the new house. Oh my God, they come inside laughing. Oh, Mama, where can I put my bed? Mama, I don't believe it. Where can I stay? This is obviously a large family who didn't have enough room in the property that was offered to them as a replacement. So as you can imagine, we had quite a few challenges in conducting this review, and the main challenge was the complexity of the data. So the pathways were very complex, and that housing insecurity was something that often just led to more housing insecurity, perhaps due to similar reasons, maybe for different reasons. So I'll give an example. So it might be that a family was sort of overcrowded. They might have moved into a property as a couple, for example, or a smaller family, and then had more children and didn't fit anymore. So they might need to then try and move. But the only available property for them to move into, perhaps due to circumstances, financial circumstances, or needing to live in a particular area, was in a really poor state of repair. So they would then accept the property because it was their only option, but then they would be looking to move again. Another example might be that they were no longer able to pay the rent, either because the rent had increased beyond their means, or they'd lost a job or something like that, or lost benefits, and then they'd be evicted from the property by a landlord and end up living in temporary accommodation, emergency accommodation, which might be, say, a B&B or a hostel. It might be overcrowded, and then this would lead to further insecurity, not just because the accommodation was temporary, so they might always be thinking that they were going to have to move, but perhaps because it was really unsuitable, overcrowded, having to share a bathroom. And also each element of housing insecurity might be experienced in multiple ways at the same time. So temporary accommodation is the prime example of this. So a child who's living in temporary accommodation, or a teenager, might be expected they are going to move at some point in the future. And it was kind of a double-edged sword, because quite often they'd want to move because it wasn't a very nice place to live. But also they might not want to move because moving introduced further uncertainty. They might not be sure where they were going to live. Would it be better or worse than where they were now? Would they be far from friends? So it was highly, highly complex. So as you can imagine, we concluded that poor housing situations have a profound impact on children and young people in many different ways. The pathways from housing to health are complex. So with our stakeholders who helped to produce the implications and recommendations, we suggested that policies should focus on reducing poor housing situation for families. They should make it more difficult for people to be evicted, so reducing the rates of eviction, the likelihood that someone will be evicted. Reducing the need for and improve the condition and suitability of temporary accommodation. Have some minimum standards for property condition that have to be adhered to by landlords and local authorities, and reduce multiple and long distance moves. So try and enable families to sort of stay in one place a bit more and the place that they need to be. And ultimately, anyone who's working with children and families concerned should give the families optimal choice and control over housing-related situations that affect them. So thank you very much for listening, and if you want to read more about this in detail, you can read our report, which is published in Public Health Research and is open access and open to everyone.